He could have just driven past like everyone else, but he didn't, and that changed everything. This is the story of Sophie, a little girl with nothing but two knitting needles, a ball of yarn, and a heart too big to fail. What happened next would touch the world. The Montana sunrise spilled gold across the frost-tipped grass outside Sophie Wells' window. She pressed her small palm against the cold glass, watching her breath fog the pain. 9 years old, with dark pigtails and eyes too serious for her age, Sophie had taken to measuring her mornings by her father's cough. How long it lasted, how deep it sounded, whether it ended in that painful silence that meant he was trying not to let her hear. Today had been a 3-minute morning. Not good. In her lap lay a tangle of blue yarn and knitting needles. She'd been working on a scarf since 4 a.m. when her father's coughing had startled her awake. Her fingers moved automatically now, the rhythm something she could feel even in darkness. Knit 2, purl 1. Knit 2, purl 1. Her mother had taught her this pattern first. Sophie builds bridges, her mother had said, guiding Sophie's small hands with her own. Between stitches, between people, between worlds. That was before cancer took her mother 4 years ago, before it came back for her father 3 months ago. Sophie, her father's voice called from downstairs, steady despite the raw edge. Breakfast, sweetheart. Michael Wells stood at the kitchen counter, setting out 2 bowls of oatmeal. At 42, his face showed the lines of someone who worked outdoors, his hands calloused from years in construction. But lately there was something else there too. A hollowness in his cheeks, shadows under his eyes that never quite disappeared. Added cinnamon, he said with forced cheer. Your favorite. Sophie nodded, sliding into her chair. Sounds good. Breakfast was quieter than usual. Michael picked at his food, occasionally glancing at the stack of mail on the counter. Envelopes with medical logos, bills in various shades of urgency. His radiation treatments had left him too exhausted to work full weeks, and the medical bills kept piling up. How's the new scarf coming? He asked finally. Sophie shrugged, stirring her cooling oatmeal. It's okay. I messed up the pattern twice. Mom would have known how to fix it. Michael's face softened. Your mom would say mistakes just mean you're making it uniquely yours. I guess. After breakfast, Sophie insisted on doing the dishes while Michael rested on the couch. From the kitchen, she could hear him on the phone with her grandmother, his voice low but clear enough in their small house. I don't know, Mom. The insurance barely covers half. I might have to sell the house. A long pause. I know she loves it here, but what choice do I have? The treatments alone are... The sound of a plate crashing to the floor cut him off. Sophie stood amid broken ceramic, soapy water, soaking her socks. Sophie, you okay? Michael called. I dropped a plate, she said, voice trembling. I'll clean it up. That night, Sophie lay awake staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars on her ceiling. Her mother had arranged them in the exact pattern of the night sky on the day Sophie was born. The thought of leaving them behind was unbearable. I can't fix Dad, she whispered to the plastic stars. I can't fix cancer. Her eyes drifted to her knitting basket in the corner. It wasn't much, but it was something she could do. Her mother's voice seemed to float through the darkness. Even oceans are made of single drops of water, Sophie girl. By morning, a plan had formed. It wasn't perfect, probably wouldn't be enough, but doing something felt better than doing nothing. The next day, Sophie gathered everything she had knitted over the past year. She found an old wooden crate in the garage and carefully arranged her creations inside. Using cardboard and her brightest markers, she made a sign, Knits for Dad, in bold, colorful letters. Underneath, helping with Dad's cancer treatment, 1 stitch at a time. Her first attempt at setting up the stand was a disaster. Wind knocked over her display. Rain forced her to cover everything with plastic. Not a single car stopped. Sophie sat alone at the end of their driveway until darkness fell, having sold nothing. It was stupid, she told her father that night, fighting tears. Nobody wants my stuff. Michael knelt beside her. First days are always hardest, kiddo. Remember when you learned to ride your bike? How many times did you fall? Like a million, Sophie mumbled. And did you quit? She shook her head. Then don't quit now, he said simply, though his eyes betrayed his doubt. The second day, Mrs. Henderson from next door stopped by, purchasing a purple scarf and pressing an extra $10 into Sophie's hand. "Your mother taught you well," she said, eyes crinkling with kindness. "She'd be so proud of you." By the end of the week, Sophie had made just over $40. She placed the money in an envelope labeled Dad's Medicine and tucked it into her mother's old jewelry box. It wasn't nearly enough, but it was a start. Every day after school, Sophie manned her stand, working on new pieces whenever customers weren't around. At night, she knitted until her fingers cramped, creating new inventory. A small jar for tips became a jar for donations. One week turned into two. $40 became 127. "You need to rest, Sophie," Michael said one evening, finding her asleep at the kitchen table, needles still in hand. "You're working too hard." "I'm not tired," she insisted, though dark circles had formed under her young eyes. "Sophie, I'm not giving up, Dad," she said firmly. "You always told me Wellses don't quit." Michael looked at his daughter, so much like her mother in that moment, with the same stubborn tilt to her chin, and felt his heart break a little more. "Okay," he said softly, "but take a break sometimes. For me." Sophie's stand became a familiar sight at the end of their driveway. Some days were better than others. Some days nobody stopped at all. But Sophie refused to give up, even when her fingertips grew raw from constant knitting, even when rain forced her to move to their covered porch, even when kids at school teased her about her weird hobby. She couldn't have known that fate was about to turn on the arrival of a dusty black SUV. Clint Eastwood had come to Montana to scout locations for his newest film, a small but personal project about family legacies and second chances. The director had suggested the natural beauty around Pine Ridge, with its sweeping valleys and dramatic mountain backdrop. He was driving back to his hotel after a particularly long day when he first passed Sophie's stand. From behind the wheel, he caught a glimpse of the small figure sitting beside a handwritten sign, shoulders hunched against the October chill, but determinedly working with knitting needles, even as daylight faded. It was a fleeting image, there and gone, but something about it nagged at him throughout the evening. Perhaps it was the girl's solitude, or the quiet dignity in her posture, or simply the fact that she was still out there as darkness approached. Eastwood had spent decades portraying characters who recognized determination when they saw it. He didn't stop that day, but the image returned to him as he reviewed location photos in his hotel room, surfacing unexpectedly between shots of mountains and old barns. The following afternoon brought heavy gray clouds and the threat of snow, the first of the season. Eastwood found himself driving down the same street. He wasn't one for detours or unplanned stops, yet he found himself slowing the SUV as he approached the girl's stand. She was there again, bundled in a coat too thin for the weather, her breath visible in the cold air. This time he pulled over to the curb. Sophie straightened immediately, smoothing down her coat and putting on her best business smile, the one she'd practiced in the mirror. She hadn't had a customer all day. The man who stepped out of the vehicle was tall and lean, his face weathered by years in the sun. He moved with unhurried confidence, hands tucked in the pockets of his jacket. A baseball cap sat low on his head, shading eyes that missed nothing. "Afternoon," he said, his voice gravelly but gentle. "Hi," Sophie replied, suddenly nervous under his steady gaze. "Would you like to see what I have for sale?" Clint nodded, taking his time to examine her creations. His fingers, strong but careful, touched the soft yarn of a blue scarf. "You make all these yourself?" he asked. Sophie nodded proudly. "Yes, sir. My mom taught me before she went to heaven." She hesitated, then added, "She said I had magic hands." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Looks like she was right." He picked up the scarf. "What's this one go for?" $20, Sophie said. Then with complete seriousness she added, "But it's worth more. It took me 3 days and I dropped a stitch in the middle and had to figure out how to fix it myself." Something in her earnestness triggered a memory. Eastwood's own mother mending clothes during tough times, refusing to let him see her worry. "I believe you," he said quietly. His eyes moved to her sign, reading the smaller text. "Your dad's sick." Sophie's expression grew solemn, but she didn't break eye contact. "He has cancer, the kind in your blood. He can't work full-time anymore, and the medicine costs a lot." She swallowed hard. We might have to sell our house. There was no self-pity in her voice, just a simple statement of facts. Clint appreciated that. In his experience, it was often children who faced life's harshest realities with the most clarity. That's a tough break, he said, nodding slowly, but looks like you're doing something about it. Sophie straightened her shoulders. I'm trying. It's not much yet, but Mom always said even oceans are made of single drops of water. Clint considered her for a moment, taking in the determination in those young eyes, the slight redness of her fingertips, and the way she kept her chin up despite the cold. I'll take this scarf, he finally said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out 2 crisp $100 bills and placed them on the table. Sophie's eyes widened. Sir, the scarf is only $20. I know what it's worth, he replied simply. Sophie carefully picked up the bills, handling them as if they might disintegrate. I don't have change for this. Don't need change, Clint said, wrapping the scarf around his neck despite the fact he was already wearing one. Seems to me you've earned every penny. Sophie blinked rapidly, trying to process what was happening. Thank you, sir. This is more than I made in 2 whole weeks. Clint nodded, watching as she carefully tucked the money into a small metal box. What's your name? He asked. Sophie. Sophie Wells. Well, Sophie Wells, seems to me you've got more courage than most folks 3 times your age. He adjusted the scarf thoughtfully. Working on a film right now about a family facing hard times. Reminds me of you a little bit. Sophie perked up. You make movies? Something like that, he said with a hint of a smile. My dad and I used to watch old westerns together. Before he got sick. Clint's eyes softened slightly. That's so? Sophie nodded. He says sometimes you have to be brave, even when you're scared inside. Like the cowboys. Your dad sounds like a wise man. Clint turned to leave, then paused, looking back at her. Sometimes life hits us hard. The trick isn't about not getting knocked down. It's about getting back up, Sophie finished, nodding seriously. That brought a genuine smile to his face. Smart kid. He returned to his vehicle, then stopped with his hand on the door. Don't give up, Sophie Wells. People have a way of surprising you when you least expect it. With that, he drove away, leaving Sophie staring after him, the blue scarf a splash of color against his dark jacket. That evening, Sophie burst through the front door, waving the money box. Dad, Dad, look what happened today. Michael, who had been dozing on the couch after his treatment, sat up groggily. What is it, sweetheart? A man bought my blue scarf, the one with the cable pattern, and he gave me this. She held out the $200 as if offering a treasure. Michael's eyes widened. Sophie, are you serious? Who would? His brow furrowed with concern. We can't accept this much from a stranger. He didn't tell me his name, Sophie said, though something about him had seemed familiar. He just said the scarf was worth it. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. And Dad, he was so nice. He said I had courage. Michael carefully took the money, turning the bills over in his hands. This is incredible, but it's not charity, Dad, Sophie insisted, recognizing the pride that made it hard for him to accept help. He bought my scarf. I worked hard on it. Michael pulled her into a hug, his embrace a little stronger than it had been in weeks. You're something else, Sophie Wells. What neither of them could have anticipated was how quickly things would change after that day. The next morning, Sophie returned to her stand, fingers stiff with cold, but heart lighter than it had been in weeks. She was arranging her newest creations when a silver sedan pulled up. A woman with a friendly smile approached, introducing herself as Lisa from 2 towns over. I heard you sell handmade knits, she said. My friend mentioned he bought a beautiful scarf here yesterday. Your friend? Sophie asked, curiosity piqued. Yes, he didn't give me his name, Lisa replied with a smile. Just said a talented young lady was selling the best handmade items he'd seen in years. Lisa ended up buying 3 hats and placing an order for a custom blanket. Before she left, she handed Sophie her business card. I own a small boutique. When you have more items ready, give me a call. My customers would love these. Throughout the afternoon, more strangers arrived. A retired couple from the next county, a teacher from the local college, a group of nurses from the very hospital where Michael received his treatments. All mentioned hearing about Sophie's knitting from a friend. By sunset, Sophie had sold nearly everything and taken orders for more. She had made over $500 in a single afternoon, more than she could have imagined possible. The next day brought even more customers. Someone had posted about Sophie's stand on social media, mentioning the quality of her work and the reason behind her efforts. People began arriving from neighboring towns, some driving more than an hour. A week later, a reporter from the local newspaper showed up. "What made you start this?" the reporter asked, notepad ready. Sophie explained about her father's illness and their financial struggles, speaking with the simple honesty that was her nature. "And business has really picked up recently," the reporter noted. "Any idea what sparked the sudden interest?" Sophie described the kind man with the gravelly voice who had bought her scarf. The reporter's eyes widened. "Wait, Sophie, was this man tall, older, with kind of squinty eyes, wearing a baseball cap?" Sophie nodded enthusiastically. "Yes. Do you know him?" By the next morning, the front page of the Pine Ridge Gazette featured Sophie's photo under the headline, "Local Girl's Knitting Stand Gets Unexpected Boost from Hollywood Legend." The article speculated that Clint Eastwood, known to be scouting locations nearby, had been Sophie's mysterious customer. "Dad," Sophie whispered, staring at the newspaper spread across their kitchen table. "It was him, the man from the movies you love." Michael shook his head in disbelief. "Couldn't be." But it was, and somehow knowing made the gesture even more meaningful. The story spread beyond their small town. National news outlets picked it up, charmed by the image of the tough guy actor supporting a determined little girl. Orders for Sophie's knitting began pouring in from across the country. People who couldn't buy her items sent donations directly to the cancer center, treating Michael, specifying they were for the Wells Family Fund. With the sudden demand, Sophie faced a new problem. Her hands simply couldn't keep up. That's when the community truly rallied. The local yarn shop donated supplies. Women from the senior center offered to help fill orders. Sophie's teacher allowed her to knit during reading time. The small house that had been so quiet for months became a hub of activity. Neighbors dropped by with casseroles and offers to help. Michael's co-workers organized a schedule to drive him to treatments. One evening, Sophie found her father sitting at the kitchen table, shoulders shaking silently. "Dad?" she asked, suddenly afraid. "Are you hurting?" Michael turned, tears streaming down his face. But he was smiling, really smiling, for the first time in months. "No, sweetheart," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Just overwhelmed. All these people. They didn't have to help us, but they are." Sophie thought of the man in the SUV, of Clint Eastwood, and his words about people surprising you. "Maybe they just needed someone to show them how," she said softly. Michael cupped her face in his hands. "Or maybe they needed someone like you to remind them what matters." 3 weeks after Clint Eastwood's visit, the first snow of winter dusted Pine Ridge. Sophie stood at her kitchen window watching white flakes spiral down, transforming the world into something clean and new. Her stand, now upgraded to a small table with a canopy, had been moved to the covered portion of their front porch to protect it from the weather. In those weeks, everything had changed. The Wells Family Fund had grown large enough to cover Michael's treatments. More importantly, his latest scan showed the cancer was responding, not gone, but retreating. He had regained enough strength to work part-time again. Sophie had created a special display at her stand, a corkboard covered with photographs sent by customers from all over the country wearing her creations. There was a firefighter in Seattle wearing one of her red hats, a kindergarten class in Ohio with matching scarves, and even a famous news anchor who had mentioned Sophie's story on national television. But success had brought challenges too. Sophie's hands sometimes ached so badly she couldn't hold her pencil at school. She'd fallen asleep during math class twice last week. Dark circles shadowed her eyes and she'd lost the childish roundness in her cheeks. "You need to slow down," Michael had told her the night before, finding her knitting past midnight. "The orders can wait." "I don't want to disappoint people," she'd replied, even as her eyes struggled to stay open. "Sophie," Michael had said, gently taking the needles from her hands, "you've done enough, more than enough." Now watching the snow, Sophie felt torn between pride in what she'd accomplished and a bone-deep exhaustion she couldn't shake. There were still bills to pay, treatments to fun. Could she really slow down? A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "I'll get it," Michael called from the living room, his voice stronger than it had been in months. Sophie heard the door open, then silence. Curious, she padded into the hallway. Michael stood frozen in the doorway, staring at their visitor. You're him," he managed finally. Clint Eastwood stood on their porch, snow dusting the shoulders of his jacket and the brim of his hat. The blue scarf, Sophie's scarf, was wrapped around his neck. "Hope I'm not intruding," he said simply. Sophie squeezed past her father. "You came back," she said, no hint of shyness in her voice now. Eastwood nodded, a small smile softening his weathered features. "Promised myself I would." He looked past them into the house. "Mind if I come in?" "Getting a bit cold out here." Michael stepped back, still speechless. "Of course, please." Inside, they settled awkwardly in the living room. Michael couldn't stop staring, while Sophie seemed perfectly at ease, as if Hollywood legends dropped by every day. "I've been following your story," Eastwood said, nodding toward a newspaper clipping on their coffee table. "Seems things have picked up around here." "Because of you," Sophie said with certainty. "No," Eastwood shook his head. "Because of you, Sophie. All I did was buy a scarf. You built something real here." He looked around at the balls of yarn piled in baskets, the orders pinned to a corkboard, the thank you letters taped to the wall. "Something that matters." Michael finally found his voice. "Mr. Eastwood, we can never thank you enough. What you started for us." He gestured helplessly, overwhelmed. "Communities take care of their own," Eastwood said simply. "Sometimes they just need a reminder." Sophie's brow furrowed. "But you're not from our community." Eastwood considered this, then said, "Some communities aren't about where you live. They're about what you believe in." Michael nodded slowly, understanding. "Like believing in a kid with a knitting stand." "Exactly." Sophie studied Eastwood's face, noting the fatigue around his eyes. Making movies must be tiring too, she thought. "Would you like some hot chocolate?" she asked. "Dad makes it with real milk, not water." A hint of amusement crossed Eastwood's face. "Sounds good." While Michael went to the kitchen, Sophie pointed to the photographs on their wall. "People send these from everywhere now. That's Mrs. Kravitz's grandson in California, and that's my teacher's sister in Florida." Eastwood listened attentively as Sophie explained each picture. The stories behind the orders, the people who had reached out. There was no pretense in her, no attempt to impress, just a child sharing what mattered to her. When Michael returned with mugs of hot chocolate, the conversation shifted to his health. "Doctors are optimistic," Michael said, a cautious hope in his voice. "It's still a long road, but—" He glanced at Sophie. "We can see the way forward now." Sophie added, "And we've been helping other families too. There's a girl in my class whose mom has cancer, and we gave them some of the extra donation money. We're starting a fund at the hospital." "Your idea?" Eastwood asked, though he already knew the answer. Sophie nodded. "Mom always said blessings should be shared." Something in Eastwood's expression shifted, a softening around the eyes, a memory perhaps of his own mother or someone who had taught him similar lessons. "Smart woman, your mom." Michael squeezed his daughter's shoulder. "The best. Sophie's just like her." As the afternoon light began to fade, painting the snow-covered yard in blue shadows, Eastwood finally stood. "Should be heading out. Still got work to finish up here." "Before you go," Michael said, hesitating, "we've been trying to figure out how to properly thank you." "Already told you?" Eastwood began, but Michael raised a hand. "I know, but sometimes even small gestures deserve recognition." His voice grew more serious. "You didn't just help with bills, Mr. Eastwood. You gave us hope when we needed it most." Sophie slipped away for a moment, returning with something wrapped in simple brown paper. "I made this for you," she said. "It's not fancy, but I wanted you to have it." Eastwood accepted the package, carefully unwrapping it to reveal a scarf unlike any of Sophie's other creations. It was midnight blue, almost black, with intricate patterns worked into the design. On closer inspection, the patterns formed letters and symbols, an S and W for Sophie Wells, a C and E for his initials, and between them, a small knitted representation of a bridge. Connecting people, Sophie explained quietly. That's what you did. For a moment, the legendary actor, known for playing tough, unflappable characters, seemed genuinely moved. He ran a weathered thumb over the intricate pattern. This is fine work, he said finally, his gravelly voice a touch softer than before. Best I've ever seen. I worked on it every night for 2 weeks, Sophie admitted. Dad helped me design the pattern. I messed up the bridge part 3 times before I got it right. As he carefully replaced his old scarf with the new one, Michael reached into his pocket. There's one more thing, he said, producing an envelope. We want you to return this. Clint looked at the envelope without taking it. What's that? The $200 you gave Sophie, Michael explained. We can't keep it now, not after everything that's happened. It wouldn't be right. Eastwood was silent for a long moment, studying the father and daughter. Then he reached out and took the envelope. But instead of pocketing it, he turned to Sophie. Tell you what, he said, how about you use this to start something new? Something for other kids with sick parents. He handed the envelope back, not to Michael, but to Sophie. Your knitting fund won't be enough for everyone, but this might help get something else started. Sophie's eyes widened. Like a special program? Where we could teach other kids to make things and sell them? Something like that, Eastwood nodded. Call it Knits of Kindness, Sophie finished excitedly, the name coming to her instantly. And we could have classes and sell online and help lots of families. Michael laughed, the sound warmer and more natural than it had been in months. One step at a time, Sophie. As they walked Eastwood back to his SUV, neighbors peeked from windows and porches, watching this unexpected epilogue to a story that had captured their community's heart. No one approached or asked for autographs. There was something in the quiet dignity of the moment that kept them back. At the vehicle, frost already forming on its windows, Eastwood turned to Sophie one last time. Remember what I said about getting knocked down and getting back up? She nodded. I remember. Keep that with you, he said, his breath visible in the cold air. Might need it again someday. I will, Sophie promised solemnly. As his SUV disappeared down the snowy road, Sophie and Michael stood side by side, the cold turning their breath to small clouds. The golden light from their home spilled across the snow, creating long shadows. Do you think we'll ever see him again? Sophie asked. Michael put his arm around her shoulders. Maybe not, but I don't think that matters. Some people come into our lives just long enough to change our direction. 6 months later, at the premiere of his newest film, Clint Eastwood walked the red carpet wearing a midnight blue scarf with subtle patterns. When a reporter asked about it, he touched it briefly and said simply, "Gift from a friend." Young lady with more courage than most folks I know. Back in Pine Ridge, Sophie watched the clip on their new laptop, surrounded by a dozen children learning to knit in the community center room, now dedicated to Knits of Kindness. The program had already spread to 3 neighboring towns and helped 6 families facing medical crises. Michael, now in remission, coordinated with social workers to identify families in need. The original knitting stand remained at the end of their driveway, a reminder of where it all began. Sophie often told the story to new children joining the program, ending with her favorite part. He didn't have to stop. He could have just driven by like everyone else, but he didn't, and that made all the difference. In quiet moments, when Montana snowstorms kept them indoors, Sophie would sometimes press her palm against the window glass, just as she had that morning months ago when everything seemed hopeless. But now, instead of fear, she felt something else, the certainty that even in the darkest times, unexpected light could find its way in. And somewhere, perhaps, a weathered face with kind eyes smiled, adjusting a midnight blue scarf against the evening chill. What do you think? Are acts of kindness from unexpected places the most powerful? Have you ever been helped by someone you never thought would notice? Share your thoughts in the comments.